Today, we're diving into the pretty wild story of Peter Gotti. He's the man who inherited a criminal empire he was, let's be honest, never supposed to rule. This is a story about how one man's spectacular incompetence, not his power, is what really came to define his entire legacy. So, picture this. It's 2004. We're in a Manhattan federal courtroom. A lawyer stands up to defend the boss of the Gambino crime family, one of the most notorious criminal organizations in America. But his defense, it isn't about innocence, it's about incompetence. He literally argues that his client was too feeble, too inept to have ever really been in charge. And that right there, that's the whole paradox of Peter Gotti's story. He became infamous not really for his crimes, but for how badly he committed them. It even earned him a nickname that, well, it would follow him all the way to his grave. To really get a handle on Peter, you first have to understand the massive, massive shadow cast by his younger brother, the infamous John Gotti. And believe me, these two could not have been more different. I mean, the contrast between them is just night and day. While his little brother John was becoming the dapper Don, famous for his swagger and those $1,000 suits, his older brother Peter was lacing up steel-toed boots and driving a garbage truck for the city. Yeah, you heard that right. For almost 20 years, Peter chose a legitimate blue-collar career. He seemed to prefer a steady city paycheck, health benefits and a pension, over the constant danger of the mob life. He was actually building a normal life, a world completely separate from his brother's growing criminal empire. But that normal life, it didn't last. A pretty serious head injury on the job pushed him into an early retirement, and that kind of pushed him right into the family business. So at the ripe old age of 49, decades later than most mobsters get their start, Peter Gotti was finally formally made. So the big question is, how on earth did a former sanitation worker end up as the head of America's most powerful crime family? Well, it wasn't through ambition, I can tell you that. It was pretty much just a process of elimination. First, his brother John gets sentenced to life in prison. Then his nephew and the chosen heir, John Jr., he gets locked up too. With all the rest of the old guard either dead or in jail, this massive power vacuum opens up. And who was left? Peter. The man his own brother famously called a dope was literally the last Gotti standing. The lack of confidence in Peter was immediate, and it was widespread. When he offered the number 3 spot in the family to a really respected captain, a guy named Mikey Scars de Leonardo, he was turned down flat. And the reason? Well, as de Leonardo put it, Peter's management skills just weren't there. Ouch. Now, this lack of respect from his own men, it wasn't just some internal problem. It quickly translated into a series of high-profile, almost comical failures that really came to define Peter's entire time as the boss. Peter's first big test as boss came straight from his brother John, who was in prison. He wanted revenge on Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, the man whose testimony had put him away for life. The mission was non-negotiable: find and kill Sammy the Bull. So the Gambino family poured $70,000 into a hit team that they sent to Arizona, where Gravano was living after he dropped out of witness protection. But the hit? It was a complete and utter bust. The team just kind of floundered around for months, accomplished absolutely nothing, and then Gravano got arrested on totally unrelated drug charges anyway. And to add insult to injury, the FBI caught Peter on a wiretap complaining about wasting all that family money. His next big blunder involved, of all people, the action star Steven Seagal. This clumsy extortion plot was just amateur hour from the get-go. The crew bragged about it on phones that were, you guessed it, wiretapped. It brought massive federal heat down on the family for a payday they never even managed to collect. So all these high-profile blunders led directly back to where our story began, a federal courtroom. And this time, the consequences for Peter Gotti were going to be severe. Peter ended up facing 2 separate federal trials. The first one, for racketeering and that whole Steven Seagal mess, landed him a sentence of over 9 years. The second one, for the conspiracy to murder Sammy the Bull, added another 25 years on top of that. It was, for all intents and purposes, a life sentence. He would die in prison. And this is where his lawyers made that infamous argument. They presented this long list of his health problems. He was legally blind in one eye, he had emphysema, post-concussion syndrome, and they even used his own brother's insults against him. The core of their defense was basically, this guy is just too sick and too stupid to be a real threat. Well, you can imagine the New York tabloids had an absolute field day with this defense. It was the New York Post that gave him the nickname that would define his legacy forever, the dumbest Don. And amidst all this legal chaos, a really deep personal tragedy unfolded. When his longtime affair was revealed in court, Peter publicly abandoned his mistress, just to save face with his family. Utterly devastated, she took her own life, a really grim and sad footnote in his downfall. So what is the final legacy of the Gotti name then? I think the best way to understand it is by comparing the fates of a father and his son. And here is the ultimate irony of this whole story. Peter Gotti Sr., the mob boss, died in prison at 81, completely abandoned by the family he gave his entire life to. Meanwhile, his son, Peter Jr., chose a totally different path. He's a bread delivery man in Queens, living that quiet, legitimate life his father always seemed to want but could never quite achieve. Peter's entire reign was just defined by a complete lack of respect. I mean, as you can see, he had no support from any corner. His own captains doubted him, other families refused to work with him, and then in the end, his own family abandoned him. This wasn't just a personal failing, it was really a symptom of the mob itself in decline, an organization that was just losing its structure, its loyalty, and its power. So, all this leaves us with one final question. Was Peter Gotti simply the dumbest Don, a man who was just bound to fail at every turn? Or was his absolute, unquestioning loyalty to his brother and his family, was that both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw, in a world that repaid that loyalty with absolutely nothing but betrayal? It's something to think about.